There was a time when other people's energy affected you more than you realized. A positive interaction could lift your mood instantly. A compliment could stay with you for hours. But the opposite was also true. A distant message could make you uneasy. A short reply could feel like rejection. A change in someone's tone could leave you wondering what you did wrong. You might not have described this as emotional dependence. Most people don't. It simply felt like caring about people, caring about connection, caring about how relationships were unfolding. But if you looked closely, your internal state often moved with the reactions of others. If someone was warm, you felt secure. If someone became distant, you felt unsettled. If someone approved of you, your confidence increased. If someone criticized you, your mood dropped. Your emotional stability was quietly tied to signals coming from the outside world. This pattern is extremely common. Human beings are social organisms. From early childhood, our nervous system learns to read emotional cues from other people. Parents' facial expressions, teachers' reactions, friends' approval. These signals teach the brain how safe or accepted we are in our environment. Psychologists often describe this process as social regulation of emotion. The presence and responses of other people help stabilize our internal state. But while this mechanism is essential in early development, it can remain active far longer than necessary. Many adults continue to experience their emotional state as something that rises and falls depending on how others behave. Carl Jung believed that this pattern reflects a deeper psychological structure. When identity is still developing, the ego tends to search for confirmation in the external world. It looks outward for signs that it is valued, accepted, approved, and when those signs appear, the ego relaxes. When they disappear, the ego becomes unsettled. In Jungian psychology, this often involves projection. We unconsciously project parts of our own psychological stability onto other people. Their attention becomes reassurance. Their approval becomes validation. Their presence becomes emotional grounding. Without realizing it, we outsource pieces of our internal equilibrium. And as long as those projections remain active, emotional independence is difficult. Your mood moves with the relationship. Your confidence rises and falls with feedback. Your sense of security fluctuates depending on how others behave toward you. Earlier in life, this dynamic can feel natural, even necessary. You might feel excited when someone shows interest in you, encouraged when someone praises your work, validated when someone recognizes your effort. These experiences are not unhealthy. They are part of normal human connection. But when emotional stability depends heavily on those signals, something fragile develops. Your center of gravity lives outside you. Other people unknowingly hold the power to influence your internal state. And because of that, relationships carry hidden emotional pressure. If someone becomes distant, you feel unsettled. If someone withdraws, you feel uncertain. If someone reacts negatively, your mood shifts immediately. This is not weakness. It is simply how an externally anchored identity behaves. But something begins to change as psychological integration progresses. You start noticing a subtle shift in how your emotions respond to other people. Situations that once influenced your mood strongly begin to carry less weight. Someone praises you. You appreciate it, but your confidence does not spike dramatically. Someone criticizes you. You consider their feedback, but your sense of self does not collapse. Someone becomes distant. You notice it, but your internal stability remains intact. At first, this change can feel strange. You may even question it. Why don't I feel as emotionally pulled as I used to? Why doesn't their approval affect me as much? Why doesn't their distance upset me the same way? Some people worry that this change means they are becoming detached or indifferent, but what is actually happening is something very different. Your emotional center is slowly moving inward. Carl Jung believed that individuation involves relocating psychological authority from the external world to the inner self. In earlier stages of development, identity depends heavily on reflection. You learn who you are partly through how others respond to you. But as individuation unfolds, that reliance on reflection begins to decrease. You start experiencing your identity more directly, not through approval, not through validation, but through internal awareness. You know who you are, not because someone confirms it, but because you have observed your own patterns, values, and capacities over time. And when identity becomes internally grounded, emotional reactions begin to stabilize. Your mood becomes less dependent on relational fluctuations. You still enjoy connection. You still care about people, but their behavior no longer dictates your emotional equilibrium. This change often becomes visible in everyday situations. For example, imagine sending a message to someone and not receiving an immediate response. Earlier, this might have triggered subtle anxiety. Your mind might begin asking questions. Did I say something wrong? Why haven't they replied? Are they upset with me? The longer the silence lasted, the more your thoughts might spiral. But now, the same situation feels different. You send the message. You continue with your day. If they respond later, you answer. If they take time, you assume they're busy. Your mood does not shift dramatically because your emotional stability is no longer tied to their response. Another example appears in praise. Earlier, compliments may have had a strong emotional effect. They felt validating, encouraging, even necessary at times. Now, compliments still feel pleasant, but they do not define your sense of worth. You appreciate recognition, but your internal confidence does not depend on it. Carl Jung believed that this shift reflects a gradual withdrawal of projections. When we reclaim the psychological qualities we once projected outward, strength, worth, validation, we stop needing others to carry them for us. We internalize them. This internalization creates emotional independence. Your stability begins to come from within. You become your own reference point. This does not mean relationships become unimportant. Quite the opposite. When emotional dependence decreases, relationships often become healthier because they are no longer burdened with the task of stabilizing your identity. You connect with others because you value them, not because you need them to regulate your emotional state. Earlier, relationships may have carried subtle expectations. You hoped certain people would reassure you, support you, confirm your importance. Now those expectations soften. You appreciate support when it appears, but you are no longer destabilized when it doesn't. Your emotional system has learned something important. Your stability is not something other people provide. It is something you generate. This realization is one of the quiet turning points in psychological development, because once your emotional center becomes self-sourced, the entire experience of relationships begins to change. You are still connected, still engaged, still capable of deep feeling, but you are no longer emotionally dependent on every reaction from the outside world. You carry your center with you, and that center moves with you wherever you go, not controlled by approval, not shaken by distance, not defined by the shifting emotional climate around you. It simply remains steady, grounded, and increasingly your own. Imagine observing a conversation where someone suddenly becomes cold. Their response is shortened. Their tone shifts. Their attention moves somewhere else. In the past, a moment like that might have created a subtle wave inside you, not necessarily panic, but a quiet internal movement. You might have started scanning the situation. Did I say something wrong? Did something change? Is there something I should fix here? These reactions often happen automatically. The mind begins trying to restore emotional balance in the interaction, because when our emotional stability is tied to other people's responses, changes in their behavior can feel like disturbances inside us. Carl Jung believed that much of this dynamic comes from how we distribute psychological authority. In early stages of identity development, the ego often places its sense of stability outside itself. Approval becomes emotional nourishment. Attention becomes reassurance. Connection becomes confirmation that we are valued. And when those signals fluctuate, the psyche reacts. If someone becomes warm, you feel lifted. If someone becomes distant, you feel unsettled. This creates a subtle emotional dependency. Not dependency in the dramatic sense, but in the structural sense. Your internal state becomes influenced by emotional currents around you. And because of that, relationships can feel psychologically intense. Small relational shifts carry disproportionate weight. A delayed response can feel like rejection. A critical comment can feel like a personal failure. A disagreement can feel like emotional distance. This happens because the ego unconsciously interprets those signals as information about its own worth. But something begins to reorganize as individuation deepens. The psyche slowly withdraws the projections it once placed onto others. In Jungian psychology, projection means assigning psychological meaning or value to something outside ourselves. For example, when we project validation onto someone, their approval feels like the source of our worth. When we project security onto someone, their presence feels necessary for our stability. But as awareness grows, these projections start returning to their origin. You begin to realize that the emotional qualities you were seeking externally already exist internally. Worth, confidence, stability. They were never fully owned before, but now they begin to integrate. And once that integration begins, emotional dependency naturally weakens. You still enjoy encouragement. You still value appreciation. But your emotional equilibrium no longer rises and falls with every relational signal. A practical example of this shift often appears in situations involving approval. Earlier in life, positive feedback might have carried a strong emotional impact. A compliment could brighten your entire day. Praise from someone you respected could feel deeply affirming. And when that feedback was absent, motivation sometimes dropped because part of your emotional regulation depended on that external reinforcement. Now the experience is different. You can receive praise with appreciation, but your motivation does not depend on it. You can continue your work even when recognition is absent because a sense of purpose now comes from within. This is one of the most visible signs of emotional independence. Your internal direction becomes stronger than external reactions. Carl Jung described this movement as a shift toward the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, represents the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When the ego aligns more closely with the self, the individual becomes less psychologically dependent on collective approval. External feedback still exists, but it no longer determines internal stability. This shift also changes the way you experience distance in relationships. Earlier, emotional distance could feel threatening. If someone became less communicative, your mind might immediately interpret the change. You might assume the relationship was weakening, or that you had done something wrong, or that you needed to repair the situation. Now, distance often registers simply as information. Someone may be distracted, busy, processing something privately, or simply needing space. And because your emotional center is no longer tied to their availability, you do not experience the same internal disruption. You notice the distance, but you remain steady. This steadiness creates a new type of relational dynamic. You allow people the freedom to move through their own emotional rhythms. Without interpreting every shift as a signal about you, relationships become less reactive, less dramatic, more spacious. And paradoxically, this often improves connection, because when emotional pressure decreases, people feel less constrained around you. They sense that they do not have to constantly reassure you. They sense that your emotional stability is not fragile, and that creates a different atmosphere, one of calm presence rather than subtle tension. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires reclaiming the psychological energy we unconsciously attach to other people. When we reclaim that energy, we stop searching for ourselves in others. Instead, we begin to experience ourselves directly. You know your value. You know your intentions. You know your direction. Not because someone confirms it, but because you have spent time observing your own inner world. That inner observation builds psychological authority. And psychological authority creates emotional independence. This independence does not mean isolation. You still connect deeply with others. You still care about relationships. You still feel empathy, affection, and appreciation. But your emotional equilibrium no longer depends on maintaining constant approval or attention. You do not feel compelled to chase reassurance. You do not feel destabilized by temporary distance. You remain centered within yourself. This kind of emotional grounding changes the experience of everyday life. Social situations feel lighter. Conversations feel more natural. Relationships feel less like emotional negotiations. You are not constantly managing how others respond to you. You are simply present. Carl Jung once suggested that the goal of psychological development is not perfection, but wholeness. Wholeness means that the different parts of the psyche no longer rely entirely on external reinforcement. They become integrated. And when that integration happens, emotional life becomes calmer, not empty, not detached, but stable. You begin to realize something important. Your emotional state is no longer something that other people control. It is something that arises from within you, and once that realization settles deeply into your awareness, a quiet form of freedom appears. You can enjoy connection without depending on it for stability. You can appreciate others without needing them to regulate your emotions. You can move through relationships with openness rather than subtle dependency, because your center is no longer somewhere outside you. Your center is here, within your own psychological ground. And that ground remains steady, even when the emotional climate around you shifts. Consider how emotional equilibrium used to operate in relationships. If someone you cared about was in a good mood, the atmosphere felt lighter. Conversation flowed easily. Your own emotional state seemed to lift naturally. But when that same person became distant, irritated, or preoccupied, the shift in atmosphere could quickly affect you. The room felt heavier. Your thoughts became more alert. Part of your attention moved toward restoring the balance. You might try to lighten the conversation, offer reassurance, explain something more carefully, or subtly adjust your behavior to prevent further distance. None of this was necessarily conscious. It was a psychological reflex. When emotional stability depends partly on relational harmony, the mind naturally tries to protect that harmony. Carl Jung believed that many people spend years unconsciously organizing their behavior around maintaining emotional equilibrium in relationships, not because they are manipulative, but because the psyche seeks stability. If someone else holds part of that stability, their emotional fluctuations begin to matter more than we realize. A partner's frustration can shape your evening. A friend's silence can influence your mood. A colleague's approval can determine how confident you feel about your work. In those dynamics, emotional authority quietly lives outside you. And when authority lives outside you, the psyche remains reactive to external shifts. But individuation gradually reorganizes this structure. The emotional center begins to move inward. At first, the change is subtle. You start noticing that other people's emotional states do not automatically become your own. Someone may be stressed or irritated, but the feeling does not immediately transfer into your nervous system. You can observe it, respond to it if necessary, but it does not override your internal state. This is not emotional disconnection. It is emotional differentiation. Psychologists often describe differentiation as the ability to remain connected to others while maintaining your own emotional stability. In earlier phases of development, emotional boundaries are more permeable. The moods of others easily influence your own. But as psychological maturity develops, those boundaries strengthen. You remain aware of others' emotions, yet you do not absorb them automatically. Carl Jung approached this process through the lens of projection and individuation. When projections are active, we unconsciously link our emotional state to another person's reactions. Their presence becomes reassurance. Their approval becomes validation. Their attention becomes confirmation that we matter. But when those projections are gradually withdrawn, the emotional structure changes. You reclaim the psychological functions that were once distributed outward. You become the source of your own emotional orientation. A simple example of this shift appears in how you experience conflict. Earlier in life, conflict often carried a strong emotional charge. If someone you cared about became upset, you felt compelled to resolve the situation quickly. You wanted to restore harmony, to make sure the relationship was stable again. The emotional discomfort could feel difficult to tolerate. But now, conflict may unfold differently. You still care about the relationship. You still listen carefully. You still try to understand the other person's perspective. But your emotional stability does not collapse during the disagreement. You can sit with tension without rushing to eliminate it. You can allow space for another person's emotions without feeling responsible for regulating them. This capacity reflects a deeper form of emotional maturity. Carl Jung believed that psychological development requires learning to tolerate inner and outer tension. The psyche becomes stronger when it can hold complexity without immediate resolution. Earlier, emotional tension might have triggered anxiety. You wanted the situation fixed immediately. You wanted reassurance. You wanted harmony restored. Now, you may recognize that relationships naturally move through fluctuations, moments of closeness, moments of distance, moments of misunderstanding, moments of reconnection. These movements no longer destabilize you in the same way because your sense of emotional ground remains within you. Another place where this shift becomes visible is in how you experience other people's approval. Earlier, approval may have had a strong emotional effect. If someone admired your work, you felt encouraged. If someone praised your efforts, your confidence increased. These reactions are normal. But when approval becomes a primary source of emotional validation, the psyche becomes dependent on it. Now, approval feels different. You appreciate it. You acknowledge it. But your sense of direction does not depend on it. You can continue moving forward even when recognition is absent. Your internal compass remains steady. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming who you truly are requires withdrawing the psychological authority we once placed in the hands of others. Approval can no longer define you. Rejection can no longer collapse you. Distance can no longer destabilize you. Because your identity has become internally organized. This internal organization produces emotional independence. You begin to feel that your emotional life belongs to you, not controlled by the shifting emotional climates around you, not dependent on constant reassurance, not tied to the unpredictable reactions of others. Your inner state becomes self-regulated, calm when others are calm when others are not, open to connection, but not dependent on it for stability. This independence does not remove your capacity for love, empathy, or connection. If anything, it deepens those capacities, because relationships no longer carry the pressure of maintaining your emotional balance. You can appreciate others without needing them to regulate you. You can care deeply without losing your center. You can experience closeness without fearing distance. Carl Jung often emphasized that true psychological growth leads to a form of inner grounding, a center that remains stable even when life becomes complicated. When that center becomes strong enough, your emotional state stops negotiating with every external variable. It becomes something quieter, something steady, something rooted. And once that rooted stability emerges, you begin to realize that emotional independence was never about becoming distant from people. It was about finally learning where your center truly belongs, not in someone else's reactions, not in someone else's approval, but within the quiet structure of your own psyche, a place that remains steady, even when the world around you shifts. At some point, you begin to notice something subtle about your emotional life. Situations that once pulled you in different directions no longer have the same power. Someone's approval feels pleasant, but it doesn't define your confidence. Someone's distance feels noticeable, but it doesn't disturb your inner balance. Someone's criticism registers, but it doesn't collapse your sense of self. And slowly, a realization begins to take shape. Your emotional state is no longer being organized by the outside world. Carl Jung believed that individuation gradually relocates psychological authority from external validation to the inner center of the psyche. Early in life, it is natural for identity to rely heavily on relational signals. We learn who we are partly through the responses of others. But psychological maturity requires something deeper, the ability to experience your own value without constant reflection. The ability to remain emotionally steady even when relationships move through natural changes. Because relationships always fluctuate. People have moods. They become distracted. They grow closer and sometimes more distant. Earlier, those shifts could feel destabilizing because part of your emotional ground lived in those relationships. Now something has changed. You can still appreciate connection. You can still care deeply about people. But your emotional equilibrium no longer depends on their constant reassurance. Your center has become internal. Carl Jung once wrote, No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This insight reflects a profound psychological truth. Emotional independence is not created by avoiding difficult experiences. It emerges from facing them. Moments of rejection, periods of loneliness, misunderstandings, disappointments. These experiences gradually force the psyche to develop its own internal stability. At first, that process can feel uncomfortable. You realize that external reassurance cannot always be relied upon. You realize that relationships cannot carry the entire weight of your emotional security. But as you confront those realities, something stronger begins to form inside you. Self-trust, inner grounding, the ability to regulate your own emotional state. And once that inner structure develops, your relationship with others begins to transform. You connect freely rather than dependently. You appreciate closeness without fearing distance. You care about people without losing your center within them. This is why emotional independence often feels quiet rather than dramatic. There is no sudden transformation, no declaration that you are now completely self-sufficient. Instead, your emotional life simply becomes steadier, more proportionate, more grounded. You respond to situations without being pulled apart by them. You remain open to others without outsourcing your stability to them. And gradually, you recognize something that may have once seemed impossible. Your emotional life is no longer controlled by shifting circumstances. It is anchored in something deeper, something internal, something that remains steady even when the world around you changes. Before we close, I'd like to hear something from you. When did you first notice that your emotional state was becoming more self-sourced? Was it during a relationship, a difficult experience, or simply a moment when you realized someone else's reaction no longer changed how you felt about yourself? Share your experience in the comments. Someone reading it may recognize the same shift happening in their own life. And if this video helped you understand a quiet change within yourself, consider sharing it with someone who might also be learning to build that same inner stability. Because emotional independence is not about disconnecting from people. It is about discovering that your center has always been closer than you thought. And once you learn to stand from that center, every relationship in your life becomes freer, calmer, and more real.